Okay, thank you, Mark. So I'm going to present our full paper. I'm Clemencia Siro, PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam. This is work we did with Mohammad, Aliannejadi, and Maarten de Rijke. So before I start, I want to put us in the same page. What do we mean by user feedback in this case? And I'm also going to try and give you a break from passages and documents, and we're going to talk about dialogues here. So user feedback here refers to the user's immediate response to the system's previous utterance. So this response can have direct or indirect feedback, whereby the user expresses their satisfaction or dissatisfaction, or the need of the user can actually involve in the follow-up utterance. So how can this feedback look like? It can be an acknowledgement where you have simple responses where a user indicates they are okay with what the system responded, or they thank the system, or they can agree or disagree where they give their own opinion, or clarify whereby they seek for more information. In other cases, they can modify their suggestion or even also change topic. And last, it's a continuation of the dialogue where they can either also switch topics or ask for more recommendations. So the objective in this study, what we wanted to see, so when we include user feedback, which is the next utterance, what is the influence of doing so when we are crowdsourcing evaluation labels for task-oriented dialogue systems? So how different are the labels in the two different setups, and also which aspects would actually benefit from the inclusion of the user's next utterance? And second, we wanted to see, we've seen that LLMs can be used to replace Crowdworkers for evaluation or collecting evaluation labels. Then the question is, are LLMs good at assessing all aspects, or are there aspects humans are better? A bit of background. So in search, we have implicit feedback, such as clicks, that can be used during evaluation. You have a query, someone is searching for a movie, and then you have a search page. If one clicks, that's like a signal for relevance or how long they get to watch it. But however, these kind of signals, they don't exist for conversational systems. This is because in a conversational setting, the system can only reply in text form and also has only ability to return a few results. So because of this, then the evaluation of conversational system relies on crowdsourced labels. So because our user ratings are expensive from the previous talks we've heard about, so if we don't have actual user ratings, then we rely on crowdsourced labels, either from humans or LLMs. However, since humans or the crowd workers and LLMs are not the actual users, one problem is that some of these labels may actually not align with the actual user need and the preferences. So this is because first, users tend to refine their needs and preferences throughout our conversation. As an example here, the user first requests for a thought-provoking movie, then gets recommendation, but in their next follow-up utterance, they're like, I want Christopher Nolan movies. Yes, the previous response actually recommends thought-provoking movies. However, none of the movies are from Christopher Nolan. They are not directed by Christopher Nolan. So in this case, we see that if we look at the next utterance users, we will get the most or the full impression of the user's preference. So if we were to evaluate the first turn, which is the user request and the system response, let's say on usefulness independently, then of course this response is actually useful because these are relevant recommendations. But then now if we were to include the next user's utterance, we realize that the response then becomes less useful because yes, they are relevant, but from the user's perspective, it's not actually what they wanted. So therefore, trying to do evaluation in singleton, in isolation for singleton, sometimes can actually lead to misleading labels. So the research questions we answer here are first, as I said, we want to look at if there is an influence of including the user's next utterance and not including when we crowdsource evaluation labels from humans and LLMs. And then next, we want to see when is actually user feedback significant to include, because the assumption is it's not in every scenario actually user feedback will benefit. In some cases, it might hurt the evaluation labels. And third, we go a step forward and try to study the sources of information that annotators rely on when they're trying to make their assessment, and how do these sources bias the evaluation labels that we collect. To answer these questions, we do this as a crowdsourcing study. So we have two setups, as I said, with and without user follow-up utterance. We use the Crowdworkers from MTAC and then use ChatGPT as an assessor. The data set here, we use Redial, which is a conversational movie recommendation data set. We ran the experiment on 100 dialogue turns. We focus on utterances where users have explicit requests for movies to ensure that their information need can be captured. So the aspects that we do crowdsource evaluation labels on, we do this for 4 aspects. That's relevance, usefulness, interestingness, and explanation quality. In relevance, we are looking at how well the system response addressed the user's request. And then for usefulness, this is more from the user's perspective, where we've seen, yes, the recommendations might be relevant, but from the user's perspective, they're actually not useful to them because that's not what they are looking for. In interestingness, we are looking at the delivery method of the system, how engaging and captivating the responses are. And then for explanation quality, here we are looking at the ability of the system to not only make recommendation, but to justify why they make the recommendation and how clear and informative are these justifications. So 2 experimental conditions, as I said before. So the setup looks like this. You have first the user request, you have the system response. For setup 1, this is where we are not showing the user's next follow-up utterance. And then you ask for rating for all the 4 aspects I showed before, and for both annotator groups, that's for humans and for LLM. And then in the second setup, it's the same dialogue, but now in this case, we include the user's follow-up utterance and still get evaluation labels for the 4 aspects and from both the annotator groups. Yeah, so let's see what were our findings. So the first thing for the first research question, we want to see, is there a difference in the ratings? Yes, this has been shown, so this is not new. Task design does influence the crowdsource labels we get. If you design a task differently, you are going to get different labels. But one thing we notice when we have setup 1, where we do not include the user's follow-up utterance for relevance, we have high agreement in Crowdworkers. And if we look at the second figure, which is for humans, the orange figure is setup 2, where we show the users the next follow-up utterance. There is a bit of variation in ratings, but it's not very significant. So humans are not affected a lot when they see the next user utterance, because ideally relevance, it's all about the user request and the system response. The way the user responds after should not affect relevance. However, for LLMs, we do see a peak that changes from setup 1 to setup 2, whereby we see if the next user's utterance tends to conflict with their previous or the actual user request, this actually leads to variation in how LLMs rate relevance in this case. But apart from that, when we compare the labels we get in setup 1 between humans and LLMs, we see that they tend to agree on same label 84% in 84% of the turns. So this shows for LLM in setup 1, both annotator groups are performing well. For usefulness, one thing we noted in setup 1, Crowdworkers tend to rate usefulness the same as relevance. I mean, we already saw it in the example of the conversation I showed, because if they don't have the next user's follow-up utterance, they're just going to look at if the recommended movies are relevant or not, so which ends up being same as rating relevance in this case. But when we introduce the user's follow-up utterance, we see a reduction of highly useful responses, and they start being somewhat useful, because now in this case, these are those relevant responses, but then it's not exactly what the user was looking for. For LLM, we observe a bit of struggle for LLMs to measure usefulness, more so trying to personalize it to the user's next follow-up utterance in this case. And for usefulness, there's less agreement on a label between LLMs and humans, because usefulness ideally is a bit subjective. It's from the user's perspective in this case. For the second research question, when is actually showing user feedback or user's follow-up utterance is significant, and in what cases does it help? From our analysis, we show that when we show users follow-up utterance in cases where we have uncertainty. So here we have ambiguous request, where the user request is not fully expressed, or we have complex request. So if we show the user's next feedback, which acts like a refinement of the initial request, it actually helps in increasing the agreement of the Crowdworkers ratings for the usefulness aspect. Second, it arguments domain knowledge of Crowdworkers. So in most cases, we make assumptions. If we ask Crowdworkers to do rating, they actually know everything they're supposed to rate. And if they don't search, then they are highly going to do an educated guess. But then if we show the next user utterance and the user understands that, oh, maybe the recommended movie I asked for was action, but this is a comedy, if we have such utterances, they actually help augment the knowledge of the Crowdworkers. Lastly, we look at what sources of information and how do they bias the evaluation labels. So we have the internal, which is the dialogue that we provide, the system response, user request, and then in setup 2, we have the follow-up utterance. Apart from that, we look how personal knowledge of the worker affects or educated guess, and if they do the search part. For both setup, we see mostly Crowdworkers rely on the system request and user request, and now follow-up utterance for setup 2. But for the biases they introduce, so this is not all, this is what I'm going to highlight for now. From online sources, when they search, if Crowdworkers see that a movie is rated highly, they tend to rate it high, or if it's rated low, then they would rate the system response low, just because that is what the majority of the crowd is talking about the movie, and don't personalize this to the actual user feedback. And then second, we see bias that comes from the personal preference of the Crowdworkers. If they've already watched the movie, they like it or don't like it, this influences how they give their usefulness ratings. And last, both workers and LLMs, they tend to favor longer responses when it comes to explanation quality. This is because they make the assumption if a response is long, then it means the system made an explanation, but this is not the case in most cases, because sometimes a system can recommend like 4 movies and make the response longer, but that doesn't mean actually it gave justification. So in conclusion, we see that user feedback does impact the evaluation labels we get. If you have 2 different setups, you're going to get a bit different ratings. When it comes to relevance, LLMs tend to outperform humans because they have a higher correlation with expert ratings. For usefulness, humans excel at personalizing these ratings, especially when you include the next user follow-up utterance, so they can personalize the usefulness rating to the user's feedback, unlike LLMs. For interestingness, both annotator groups struggle to capture this because interestingness is a bit subjective based on the actual user's perceptions. For explanation quality, we see an agreement between the bots showing that the data set we use is lacking explanations, but LLMs are a bit more objective in these. So finally, yes, we have seen how both perform, but then what does this mean? An ideal approach, take it with a grain of salt, because one caveat of this is that the results might vary with different LLMs and annotator pool, but an ideal approach would be leverage these both annotator groups in where they perform well. So if LLMs are good at objectivity, then you can use them for measuring, for assessing objective aspects, and then humans can be used for subjective aspects. And users' next utterance seems to be a very critical feature when it comes to automated assessment, because now we see if we have the user's feedback, we can actually personalize the assessment, and we can use this as a feedback loop to improve the system. And lastly, for future work, I've said this was done on a single LLM. We would like to validate these results across diverse conversational systems and different LLMs. Thank you.
Thank you.